Namaste and welcome to Detours with me, Anuradha Goyal, where I talk to some very interesting personalities about journeys of all kinds.
Namaste and welcome to Detours. Today we have a very special guest on this podcast, Sri Martin Gray. He is an anthropologist and a photographer who's been to 160 plus countries and who has photographed more than 2,000 plus pilgrimage sites. You know, pilgrimage is something that I am very interested in, and I've been writing about a lot of pilgrimage places, sacred places in India primarily. So few days back, I got an email from Martin G saying that, this is my website, which is called sacredsites.com. And you can use any of these photographs free of cost, and you can simply use them. And then I looked at the website, and it was like discovering a treasure. You know, I have been, since last few days, I've been wandering on that website. I'm yet to visit all the individual sites, but I've been reading about what a sacred site is, and I got some very valuable information. And I could also correlate a lot of it to what I am reading in Indian scriptures about pilgrimage sites. So we're going to talk about that. So Martin Ji, welcome. First of all,
thank you for offering this to me and to the viewers. Yes.
So Martin Ji, you've been to so many pilgrimage places, for work as well as for your own journey. So tell us, what is a sacred site? What makes a site sacred?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you asked for my work and for my own journey. And actually, this all began for my own journey. And I just happened to take a camera along, and I take these pretty pictures. And people say, oh, you're a great photographer. And I go, no, I'm not. I photograph great art. And for me, this is bhakti yoga. This is a service. And I have always felt that these photographs, and actually, I don't even consider them photographs. I consider them windows. And, if you go to Indian pilgrimage sites and there's a deity, the devotees will get the darshan of the deity. And yet that darshan goes both ways. The deity is seeing the devotee, and the devotee is seeing the deity. And so for me, with my photographs, I consider my photographs of these deities, of these sacred sites, they're actually sort of windows whereby a human being looking at these windows, looking through these windows, in a sense, is getting the darshan of the sacred sites and the darshan of the deities. So I have been lucky, very, very lucky, that it was given to me as a service, that I was able to go to these places all over the world. And at this point, it is over 2,000 of these in over 160 countries during the last 40 some years that I've been doing this. And for me, it always has been an active practice of bhakti yoga, of devotion to the divinity. And I just feel that is my service to share these with people as widely as possible. So you say, what is a sacred site? Well, a lot of times I create this distinction. There are many temples. There are temples all over India, thousands and thousands of temples. In Europe, there are thousands of churches. In Buddhist Asia, there are thousands and thousands of temples, but there is a distinct difference between normal temples and pilgrimage temples, a distinct difference between normal churches and pilgrimage churches. In pilgrimage places, pilgrimage churches or temples or mosques or shrines, they are places that people come to these places from a long distance, such that there is no such thing as a local pilgrimage place. There are pilgrimage places that people in the local area will come to, but pilgrimage places by definition are sites that people come to them from a long distance. And so as an anthropologist, they will often say, well, what is the catchment field? Where do they come from? Is it a regional? Is it a national? Is it a hemispheric? Or is it an international pilgrimage place? And I happen to visit all of them, all over the world. And then people say, well, why do you do this? Well, this took me about 20 years to understand, is that when you go to these places, it doesn't matter whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. There's only two things that are happening. And those two things that are happening are people are saying, please and thank you. They're praying to a deity for something, whatever it is they're praying for. If we put aside the particularity of what they're praying for, people are saying, please. Or they're going to the sites and they're saying, thank you for that which they have been given from a previous prayer. So people say, well, why do you go to these places? And I go to these places because I want to share the photographs with people and I want to have the benefit myself. And that benefit is, I like to go to the places on the planet where people have expressed the most gratitude in prayer. So whatever the religion is, whatever it is, when you go to these places, when you go to these sacred sites, you're in a small area that is the most charged, the most concentrated places on planet Earth for those two human emotions of praise and prayer of God. And that's a wonderful way to spend your life, to go to those type of places.
That's very interesting, because when you praise or when you pray or even when you ask for something, you're also keeping your ego aside. And that's one of the spiritual goals that people have to, to get over your ego. But it still remains a question, what makes a site sacred? What are the elements of a sacred site?
Well, on my website, the World Pilgrimage Guide, sacredsites.com, there's a section of that where I talk about that in some detail.
Right.
And first of all, I talk about 32 different types of sacred sites, different types of pilgrimage places, and I give examples of each of those 32 ones. And then I say, well, what makes a pilgrimage place a pilgrimage place? What makes a sacred site a sacred site? And reading a great deal about this, I've read over 2,000 books on this subject in the last 40 years and have gone to all these places. And I thought, are there common denominators? Are there commonalities about this? And over all these years of reading and visiting these places, I've come to understand there's actually 20 different factors that contribute to the power of place. 20 different factors. No sacred sites have all 20. Some have 2 or 3, some have 4 or 5. But it's the combination of these different factors that contribute to the power of place. And so it's a very interesting thing about this notion of power of place. And I often like to make an analogy that if you put a tea bag of tea into a cup of hot water, the tea will steep into the water. And then by drinking it, you have the benefit of the medicinal qualities or the taste of that tea. And to say that if you take a piece of photographic film and you point the camera at whatever you're photographing and you press the shutter button and the shutter opens for maybe 1,000th of a second, and then the film has a memory of what it saw. Or if you have a tape recorder and the tape is going across those rollers and someone sings into the microphone, then that remembers that sound, or the film remembers the view. Well, in the same way, if you have, and those are the film and that little tape on a tape recorder, those are pieces of the earth. So if you have a larger piece of the earth, like a sacred site, and you have millions and millions of people that have come to it, and they pray there, well, my feeling is, I feel very, very strongly about this, that the place remembers that. As a photograph, a little bit of film can remember what it saw in 1,000th of a second. So imagine inside of a temple, a place where people have come, millions and millions and millions of people have come for thousands of years and have prayed. The place remembers that. Place has memory. And so a sacred site is a place that has been invested by tradition with sanctity for thousands and thousands and thousands, millions of people for thousands of years, and the place remembers it. And so when we go to that, in a sense, you think about this, if you plug a lamp into the wall, well, the energy of electricity comes into the lamp and it illuminates, you turn on the switch. So when a human being goes to one of these places, these sacred sites, in a sense, they're plugging into the power of place. They're plugging into that accumulated devotion, that accumulated divinity of millions of people. That is my feeling from having been to so many of these places and read so many books. That's feeling about these places.
I totally agree with you. I've been to many pilgrimage places in India, and I always say that you contribute to the place as much as you take from the place.
Both ways.
It works both ways. Yes.
And a nice thing to know about India that I want to say, India's people, everybody was saying, well, what is your favorite world? And I say, India is my favorite country. Why is that? Well, the food, in my opinion, is the best food in the world, especially down in Tamil Nadu, Pongal in Italy, and dosas. But India also has the most vital pilgrimage tradition on planet Earth. It has the most beautiful sacred sites on planet Earth. Now, someone could say I'm biased because I've been to all 28 states in India. I've spent 5 years traveling in India, and it's my favorite country in the world. So, yes, I tell that people all the time. India is my favorite country in the world.
Well, I was blessed to be born in this country. So, and I happen to, I started as a traveler, but now I've become more of a pilgrimage traveler, and I'm trying to study pilgrimage traditions. And as I was telling you before we started this conversation, that what I read on your website actually matches quite a bit with what Indian scriptures tell us about pilgrimage. Or, there's a classification in Brahma Puran. There's a classification of pilgrimage sites where it says there are 4 types of pilgrimage sites. One, where the devatas have come, where the gods took an avatar and they lived, or they're associated with deities in some way. For example, Kashi is associated with Shiva, Mathura is associated with Krishna, so on and so forth. Then there are Rishi Tirthas, where the saints have sat down and practiced or done tapasya. Then there are Asura Tirthas, where the demons got killed, And the 4th one is the Manav, which is the human made, where humans have done an effort and mitigated it into, and which is essentially what your website also kind of classified it into. Of course, there are many ways of classifying. There is one classification I found based on how difficult it is to reach that pilgrimage place.
Yeah, like the Char Dham are very difficult to reach. Now it's more easy to do so, but in past times, and like very difficult. Now have made a train over there, but Kailash was very, very difficult to get to. And many pilgrimage sites have been very difficult to get to. For example, Sabarimala in Kerala, very, very difficult. And people go on a long walking pilgrimage for 40 days just before they even go to Sabarimala.
Right.
And the journey is very, very important. A lot of people think, oh, it's just being at the pilgrimage site. The journey is also very important because during the journey, what we're doing is we're communing with God. We're praying. We're considering what we're bringing to the sacred site. We're considering how we're living our lives. So pilgrimage journeys are also very, very, very important.
Yes. So the tradition says that you must prepare for that pilgrimage. You just can't get up and go. And I could find 2 living traditions. One is Sabrimala. In fact, I just recorded one episode on Sabrimala Yatra and how you prepare for it. And the other is something called a Vari pilgrimage, which is done in Pandharpur. I'm sure you've been there.
Yes.
So those are 2 traditions which still follow the pilgrimage traditions to a large extent. Everything else has kind of become hop, skip, and jump. But let me ask you, you spoke about the recharging of the places. Now, does a pilgrimage site has to be an ancient or an old site?
No, and that's a very interesting question because, again, I talk about different types of sites. Well, there's a religion called the Baha'i, and it's really sort of centered in Israel, but it's a new religion. And you think about some Sufi saints, and really Sufism is a really, really good example. Because here you have a teacher. He was a healer. He was a teacher, and people coming to see this teacher, and wherever it was, whether it's Sufi or Shia, doesn't really matter, wherever it is in the Islamic world. And people had been coming to see this sage as a teacher. Mm-hmm. And then the teacher dies. Mm-hmm. And the place had no pre-existing sanctity. It was just a place where he happened to live. Mm-hmm. And then pilgrims start coming. Mm-hmm. And they come for 10s, 30s, 100, 200 years, hundreds and hundreds of years. And then the place becomes charged by that. The place becomes invested with sanctity. It had no pre-existing sanctity. And the teacher perhaps wasn't even considered a guru, wasn't considered a saint. He was just much loved. But because so many people came for so long, the place becomes charged. Now, a lot of sacred sites, you will find that sacred sites, some of them are very, 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 very old. And if we look at them archaeologically, we'll find out, oh, there was one culture and then another culture and another culture. But with Sufi saints, a lot of times that's not true. It's just where the Sufi saint lived. But it's by the people visiting. So this is really, really important, because I talk about 20 different factors that contribute to the power of place, but I say they're in 4 major categories. And one, and perhaps the most important category, is the category of human intention. And what do I mean by human intention? Well, the intention of the initial builders of the site. And whether it was a very rich Raja, and he had money, and maybe in the 10th century in India, and he decided he was going to build a particular place, and then they get some people together and they use Vastu, and they design it in a certain way, but there's intention. The person who funded it, who built it, who designed it, and then they installed priests there, and the priests had an intention, and all of these years, all of these centuries of ritual, of ceremony, all of that is charging the place. All of that is a compilation of the intensity of intention. And then you have these millions and millions of pilgrims that come and they're praying. And all of these prayers, all of this intention is focalized at a very, very specific place inside of those temples. So the places are being charged. Now, many, many temples, they are at places, and this is very, very true in a lot of the sacred sites in India, the pilgrimage sites in India, we can talk about them as having astronomical or celestial importance also, and their orientation. So there's a number of different reasons the places have power, but this one that is so important to me is human intention. So important to me.
And what about the natural element of pilgrimage places? Because in my research, I found that mountains, rivers, lakes, ponds, forests, they are also treated as pilgrimage places. And at least in India, all major pilgrimage places have a water body, which is the most sacred part of that region, or kshetra as we call them. So water element, and you mentioned memory, that the place has a memory of millions of people coming and praying. And I'm told that water has the strongest memory. And water element is what we treat as the biggest pilgrimage place. So talk about the natural element of pilgrimage.
Well, it is true that water is very, very important. And if you think of the Kumbh Mela sites, Nasik, Ujjain, Haridwar, and Allahabad, all of them are at water locations. All of those I've been to. Water is very, very, very important. And yet, there are some places where it's just the mountain is very, very important. Tiruvannamalai, right. Sacred mountains. So sometimes water is important and sometimes it's not important. So it really depends upon the place. When you think about sacred forests, well, the forests like Haridwar and Rishikesh, these were places, and it's very interesting if you speak Hindi, Rishikesh and Haridwar, they were both places where saints and sages were yogis, forest yogis went and meditated. Okay, they happened to be, near water, and the saints were going there for the water. They were going there for the water, but these were places where saints and sages were meditating. Gurus and yogis were meditating. And so it is a place where there's this concentrated human intention. And a lot of devotees will go to places where the saints and the sages meditated. Yes, some of them were by water, but some of them weren't by water. Some of them were just places. Well, then, then you get them the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and there's reasons that they're sacred too. But not all are water. And then the Shakti Peeth are very, very, very important. Very, very, very important. This is a very important, to me, very important set of sacred sites. Very, very important. And an incredible legend too. An incredible legend, which most Western scholars don't understand. And most Western scholars, this is a really important thing to say. Many scholars, they study the institution of pilgrimage from a scholarly standpoint. I don't feel that's enough. I think it's very, very important that you also have to have the experience. Doesn't matter books you read. You also need to go to the sites. And if you haven't gone to the sites, you're really not plugging in. You just have this intellectual notion. And it's really interesting because if you study the anthropology of pilgrimage and of something that I've studied very much, it always amazes me that these cultural anthropologists, they measure things, they count things, they interview pilgrims and they ask them questions, but very rarely do the scholars themselves talk about their own experience. And a lot of times if a scholar talks religious experience, the university administrators, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to interview pilgrims and keep charts and measure things, but you're not supposed to talk about your own experience. And so that's something that I do. I read all books and I interview all these pilgrims in English because I only speak English. And then I have these experiences myself. And I go as a traditional pilgrim. I have both of these experiences. I have this deep scholarly understanding of all these different religions, and I have my own personal experience of these places.
So I'll just give you a data point on that. I have edited a book, co-edited a book on Navratri, which is one of our festivals, 9-day festival. So I read a couple of books written by scholars, and they had written something like the caste analysis of the girls who are worshipped. We call them Kanya. So they had written about that. Now, I have been a Kanya when I was a young kid, and I've been a part of the tradition. I have never seen this happening. Nobody asks a caste because a Kanya is a Kanya. She has to be worshipped. You don't ask a deity their caste. So it made me very angry when I was reading that. I said, this doesn't happen. You go and insert it into records. And that's when I said, let me gather people who are practitioners. And then we got in touch with 16 different people who are intellectually good, but they are also practitioners with faith. And we wrote this book, which is a practitioner's point of view. So which has an angle of devotion, of bhakti. Yes, I'm documenting what happens, but there is an element of devotion. I believe in it. It's not an outsider's view. So I totally get it. And lot of work that I am doing right now comes from exactly this point that most people write. When I was going to Dwarka, I was reading a book. I gathered all the books. There are not too many on that city. And after coming back, I realized that the persons have written the book without ever visiting the city. So I know what you mean by that, and that's why I have so much respect for you. But I'll come back to my questions. What do you think is the relevance of sacred site for a modern youth who are not so much of a believer in the religion or in the pilgrimage tradition?
Now that's a very, very good question. And just earlier today, I was going from one place. Right now I'm in Vilnius, in the capital city of Lithuania, and I took a taxi with a man, and we're talking a little bit, and he says, "Where do you think I'm from?" And immediately I said, "You're from Iran." He said, "How do you know this?" Well, I said, "I've been to Iran 2 times, and I've probably been more places in Iran than you have." And then he said, "Where have you been?" And I showed him a map, and he said, "Oh, you have been to more places in Iran than me." And then he said, "Well, people in Iran, especially the youth, they don't like these places anymore." And I understand why some don't. I understand that. And there have been some problems, definitely have been some problems in Iran because of the rulers of Shia over there. There have been problems. Yes, I agree with that. And you will see around the world, you will see many youthful people who do not understand very often. Many of them don't understand their religions at all. They have a resistance to it. And you will see a less and less interest in religion. And he said, what do you think about that? And I said, I understand that. You will see a decrease. There's been a number of articles that I've read in the past few months about church attendance in both the United Kingdom, in Europe, in the United States. Church attendance is going down and I understand why people are doing this. But a really interesting thing, really interesting thing is I used to call my website, before it was called World Pilgrimage Guide, I called it of Peace and Power. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's these sacred sites, and in one sense, you can look at them through the lens of religion, and you can the sacred site. And sometimes I don't even like to call them sacred sites because people, they'll go, I'm not interested in religion. I'm not interested in the sacred. And I go, okay, there's three types of people that go to these places. There's religious pilgrims. Buddhists go to Buddhist sites, Hindus to Hindus, Christians to Christians. People go to these sites due to the momentum of religious tradition. Okay. Then there's another category of people that go to these places, and they're tourists. And what do you mean tourists going to these sites? Well, tourists go to places like Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid or Angkor Wat or Machu Picchu, and they're not going for religious reasons at all. They're going to see monumental architecture. Monumental architecture. When they go to England, they go on a tour, and the tour goes to the British Museum, and it goes to this, and it goes to that. And a lot of times it goes to Salisbury Cathedral, and it goes to Stonehenge, or it goes to Avebury. And the people, they don't know where they are. They think, oh, this is an interesting archaeological site. Yes, but you're still at a holy place. You're still at a power place. You're still at a place that some people consider to be a sacred site. And whether you understand what that means or not, you're still there. For example, that if it's very cold outside and you have a dog, it's very, very cold outside, and the dog will come into the house because it's warm. Now, the dog cannot explain to you about thermal gradient. It can't say that. It feels better where it's warm. In the same way, a human being, when you're at one of these sites, because I've interviewed so many people, even people that are just, they think they're tourists. And I said, well, what do you feel? They go, oh, I love it. It's nice. I go, well, why does it feel good? And they go, I can't explain, but yesterday, and it didn't feel so good at the fortress, but here at this temple, at this mosque, it feels good. Explain why, but they feel something, and they don't know the words to express. So then there's the third type of people like us, and we're not only going because of the momentum of religious tradition, and we're not only because places are of monumental art, but we're going because we understand something above and beyond just religious tradition. There's a feeling that we relate to. And there are more and more of us doing this. And in my 40 years of traveling around the world, going to these places, I've seen more and more people like you and I going to these places, such that I feel that we're at the beginning of what I call a Gaian, from Gaia, the Greek word for earth. We're at the beginning of a Gaia age of pilgrimage. There is something happening on the planet now. More and more people are visiting these sites of their particular religious tradition, and outside of just the interest in archaeology or monumental art, there's a feeling, there's a love, there's something that people are. There's a spiritual magnetism to these places is beyond. It's a quality as a people, and that's happening especially strongly for the. I go to these places, side, whatever the sacred site is. Young people at them, many people at them. If I talk to them, maybe they have a disagreement with their religion, or the religion that is practiced at the site. But if you put the religion that at the site aside, they will and they'll say they feel love at these places. They feel connection to these places. They feel places. There are a number of youth that are understanding that now. And that makes me very happy. Maybe they're not practicing a particular religion. That's all right. Because ultimately, it's not about religion. Ultimately, it's about a human being being connected with what I call great spirit. It's about a human being being connected with God. And God is not Hindu or Buddhist or Jewish or Christian. No. God is beyond all of that. Because religions, in a sense, are the creation of human beings. Because if we go back 1,000, 100, or Neptune, we go to another galaxy. Great spirit, God exists there. God, oh no, human ideas exist 10 million light years away from here. None. But that spirit, that power of God is there. That spirit, that power of God is what makes the universe exist, not human ideas about religion. No, that's a human invention.
Another question I had for you was, do you think there is a concentration of pilgrimage sites or sacred sites in certain parts of the world, or do you think they are spread all over the place?
Very good question. Well, first of all, 72% of the earth is covered by water.
Right.
That's important to understand. So then if we say, well, where are the other? Well, in my writings, what I do is I talk about a number of types of sacred sites. And if you study, there are a number of sacred sites that we can say on the earth because of geophysical anomalies is how they talk about it in Europe, the megalithic sites. Megalithic just means big stone, Stonehenge, Avebury, they're long. If we study, well, why are they where they are? Sometimes we can say these megalithic sites are where they are is because of the present underground water. Sometimes there's no water on the surface. A certain type of people that are called dowsers, and they use different types of dowsing tools, will be able to sense the presence of underground water or high concentrations of different minerals in the or underground. And somehow people in antiquity, they don't have any records were kept. We don't know how they spoke, but somehow they were able to sense the presence of underground water or the presence of high concentration of the different minerals. And they sensed these, and then they placed their megalithic structures, what we call as sacred sites. They placed those at these sites, and they continued to visit them. And then as population grew, more and more people went to these places. And then a lot of times social centers, cities, towns, villages grew at these places. So you will find that type of site all over the world. Then there are certain cultures, and India is the best example of this. India is the best example. India has the highest concentration of pilgrimage sites of any country in the world, by far, the highest. Japan is high, Italy is high, France is high, Mexico is high, but India is by far the highest concentration. And there's historical and religious reasons that it can explain that. That's a larger discussion that I could have. But I would not say of power places, and this is an important distinction about what I'm going to make here. There are many power places that never became sacred sites, and there are many sacred sites that didn't have their genesis as power places. Power places are places that I would say have some sort of geophysical anomaly that human beings discovered, and so they began using them, and then they became sacred sites. But other sacred sites, like a lot of Islamic sites of Sufis, were not power places. They weren't. They were just where a sage, a teacher lived. Sometimes there is a overlay. Power places become sacred sites, and then sacred sites turn into power places because so many people visit them. But we cannot say there is a one-on-one correlation between the two. It took me 25 years before I understood the difference between those two things. So not all sacred sites are power places, and not all power places become sacred sites. There's a distinct difference between the two, and it's very important. Excuse me?
Example of power place?
A really good example is where I've been sort of making my home the last 20 years when I'm in the United States is a place in the United States called Sedona, Sedona. Now, Sedona has no pre-existing sanctity. There's no archaeological evidence that any of the Native American tribes used it in whatsoever. They had some very limited trade routes that went through it. And at some of the places along those trade routes, people lived. And at some of those places where they lived, they had some sort of religious ceremonies, but there's no indication whatsoever that it was a pilgrimage site in antiquity. Then in the early 1970s, an American woman named Paige Bryant, she came there and she had this notion that there were some sites on the land there that were power places. And so she wrote a book called The Earth Changes Survival Handbook. I know Paige, I read the book, she's now passed away. And in that book, she talked about these places that had some power. There's no evidence of it whatsoever. But because it went in the book, and because a lot of Americans read the book, and they got this notion in their head, oh, these are power places. And then they started coming. They came by the millions over the last 20 years. And so these places became charged, but they were not pre-existing sacred sites, not at all. They were just pieces of land. And I've been all over the Sedona area. I'm really well known there for climbing on all these things. And there were no sacred sites whatever. But now, because some people believe there's seven, they believe there's these vortex sites, and there's nothing pre-existing at the vortex site. But now, because so many people have gone there with belief and with prayer, the places are charged by human intention. So now they become a magnet. They have a spiritual magnetism because of the belief of people. And the places now are charged. Because if you get modern day dowsers, of which I'm a really good one, but they use different dowsing tools. And the dowsing tools, all they do is they magnify a response of the central nervous system. The copper rods or the pendulum, they don't do anything. It's just the person holding them. But if you know how to dowse, if you're good at that, and you go to these vortex sites, oh my gosh, there's a response. There's a response. How do we explain that response? When there was nothing 25 years ago. How do we explain that response? And I feel that you explain the response by so many millions of people have gone there. And just as I said earlier, light on photographic film leaves an impression, leaves a trace. And so when you get millions of people going to a particular place with a particular belief, with a particular prayer, it leaves a trace, it leaves an impression, and that becomes a sacred site. So Sedona, which was not a pre-existing sacred site, was nothing. And now it has become one because of people's belief. And I could give you many, many examples of that sort of thing happening around the world.
So there are certain places on Earth which are supposed to have naturally have a power, or naturally they are inclined to, or how do I say? They are aligned to certain energies, and a lot of the sacred sites, I believe, are on those points on Earth. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a really good question also, because, and you started your question of aligned. So the word aligned comes from line. Now, if you study megalithic matters in England, primarily in England, some in France, you're going to hear about an antiquarian. He wasn't an archaeologist. He was an antiquarian. His name was Alfred Watkins. And in 1921, he published a book called The Old Straight Track. And Alfred Watkins, it was his hobby to travel around the English countryside, and he was attracted to these places of monumental architecture, stone rings, and pre-Reformation pilgrimage cathedrals. And when he was at them, he took some pictures, but he just liked the places, and he would mark them on a map where he'd been. And one day he was looking at his maps and he went, oh boy, look at this. You can draw straight lines between them. They're in linear arrangement. How do you explain that? So he used an old Roman word called ley, L-E-Y, and he called them ley lines. And ley is a Roman word that means a trackway for commercial transportation purposes. But a lot of these ley lines that Alfred Watkins found are arrow straight. They're completely straight. And yet there's meandering lines that were used by people walking or taking carts to transport things. So after a number of years, he stopped using that word ley, and he just used the word old straight tracks. But in the United States and in Europe, there has been a misappropriation of people who don't know what they're talking about. They use this word ley, and they don't know what they're talking about, and they use it indiscriminately. And they say there's all these ley lines. Yes and no. If you really understand the subject, and you have to read a number of books to do that, you will find that in some cases, there are in fact lines, straight lines of sites around the world. And a friend of mine named Paul Broadhurst, who's written 7 wondrous books, wrote 2 books which were about these lines that you can trace from in a certain place in England all the way down to the Holy Land, and another one across southwestern to southeastern England, where there are all these churches and megalithic sites along them. And if you douse these lines, and these are not meandering lines, these are arrow straight lines. If you douse them, there are earth energies. There are some type of energy along these lines that sensitive dowsers can find. How do we explain those lines? Okay, now I'm speculating. I'm not saying what I'm saying is right. I'm speculating. There is something that you could call an earth grid. And some people will say there is a grid of power places around the planet. I've read all the books written about this subject. And I think probably I know as much about this subject of earth grids as anybody in the world. And if you said, well, what do you know? I go, I don't know so much. I meet these other people that know very little, and they say they know a lot. And I go, well, actually, you don't. Here, I've been to 2,000 of these places in 40 years in 160 countries, and they've read 2,000 or 3,000 books. And what do I know? This much. But I meet people who have very little knowledge, very little experience, and they say they know this much. I think this is human arrogance. So here you have a human being who possibly has been to as many of these places as any human being ever and has read all of these books, and I know very little. And yet, I feel this, there is some sort of grid of these power places, not sacred sites, power places on the planet, some of which were discovered, some of which were used in a religious reason for religious functions, some of which became sacred sites. I feel there is probably, I'm not sure, I feel there is probably a grid or even more than one grid of these power places on the planet. I feel it is very important that more scientific study happens of these. There's no scientific study happening at all now because most scientists, locked into a box, do not really understand spirit. And so this study is not happening at this point. And I'm hoping the youth who are now starting to visit these places, and they're not boxed in by a particular religion, the youth, I'm 69 years old, the youth will start asking certain questions that are essential to ask. And because they're not boxed in by a certain religion, they'll be able to look at things in a freer way, a non-religious way, and they'll be able to go, there's commonalities here. There's commonalities here. There's things that science is not being able to explain that we need to look at more deeply. And I think if enough people study this and look at this, I think we will begin to discover that there are, in fact, subtle grids of energy, grids of subtle energy on the planet that account for some, not all, of the power place positions on the planet. I'm pretty sure of that, but I'm not sure.
So next question I have is about the celestial connection of the sacred site, So I strongly believe, as you already mentioned, that a lot of temples in India are aligned to the celestial movements. Again, this is a conjecture. It's not something that I'm very sure of, but I believe that a lot of our pilgrimage paths, which is what we call parikrama or circumambulation, a lot of them actually imitate some celestial motion in the sky. just like you mentioned, Kumbh Mela, which actually imitates the movement of Jupiter in the sky. We actually have something very similar to Kumbh Mela every year, because the Jupiter changes the zodiac every 1 year. So every 1 year we have a festival at one of the rivers. So I have a feeling that there is a very strong connection between pilgrimage routes and celestial motions. So if you know anything about it, please share.
Oh, first of all, another good question. And that's a big subject. I can talk on that for quite a while. So,
go ahead.
Okay, now I'm going to speculate on something again. What I'm going to say is there are 4 different celestial objects: the sun, the moon, the planets, and different stars, whether single stars or stars in constellation. So my feeling is that when different celestial objects are in a positional relationship with the planet, it causes a fluctuation of energy at certain power places. Not all, at certain power places. Okay, again, when different celestial objects are in a positional relationship with the planet at certain times, and you could say, well, what times? Well, here's the disadvantage, because a lot of times people, when you say what times, they'll go, well, when is it? Is it June? Is it May? Is it August? Is it September? And I go, that's a problem to do that, because the solar calendar and the equinoxes and the solstices and the cross-quarter days, if we try to put Venus days into the solar calendar or lunar days into the solar calendar, it's problematic, because the moon has its own cycle and Venus has its own cycle, and different celestial objects that are stellar objects, they have their own cycles that are independent of solar cycles, but people try to fit them into the solar cycle. So we must understand that. First of all, you cannot fit a celestial or a lunar or a planetary object into a solar cycle.
Yeah.
For convenience sake, we can do that, but we must, preceding that convenience, understand, oh, okay, it would have its own celestial cycle, such that if you were to ask Venus, how do you feel about being stuck in the solar cycle? Venus would go, wait a minute, I've got my own cycle. Why can't we talk about my cycle? But a human abstraction, a human notion is, well, we'll fit it into the solar cycle. That's very, very important to understand.
That's where I found the answer in the Indian calendar that we follow, which is a lunisolar calendar. And I was doing a mapping, and this is still a work in progress for me. I happen to work on one of the pilgrimage sites, Ayodhya. I created a map, recreated a map of Ayodhya, and when I was looking at the festival calendar and the festival calendar of India, I found that all the festivals fall at some transition point.
See, that's also very important. Those transition points, very, very important.
Yeah. So I can actually talk for an hour on those transition points. Maybe we'll have another conversation on that. But I wanted to know that.
Okay, I want to continue with what I'm saying. So you have these 4 different categories of celestial objects. Okay.
Right.
So then you would have an alignment, an association, very important, an association with different pilgrimage sites, different power places, with different celestial objects. Very, very important. Then you have, what is this? Why are the different sacred structures, why are they aligned the way they are? Why are they pointing in the direction they're pointing? So if you study astronomy, you're going to hear about a term called heliacal. And heliacal is the arising of a particular celestial object on the horizon, the first time you can see it. Now, nowadays, people think of astronomy as looking through large of glass at something very far away. That's not the astronomy that was practiced in antiquity. The astronomy that was practiced in antiquity is horizon astronomy. And horizon astronomy is very, very interesting to note. If you look at the megalithic sites in Europe, these stone rings, you will see that these stone rings were used to predict in advance of their occurrence particular days in the celestial cycles. And using these stone rings, people were able to watch the movement of different celestial objects along the horizon. In the first day that a certain celestial object is noticed to rise in the horizon is a very important day. And those days give rise to the directional orientation of some, not all, some of the pilgrimage sites, some of the structures at the sacred sites. That is a really fascinating thing to know. So that in itself, oh, there's so much in that of these lines. Oh, this becomes a really, really fascinating set of discussions. Archaeoastronomy is what it's called. Archaeoastronomy, the astronomy of archaeology, the archaeology of ancient civilizations. Really, really, really fascinating subject. And on my website, one of the things on my website, World Pilgrimage Guide, there's bibliographies. And there's two bibliographies. One that has about 2,000-3,000 books I suggest that people read. I've read all of them. And then another one has 32 different categories. 35 different categories. Each one of these categories is specific to a certain subject. There's a category just on Buddhism. There's a category just on goddess sites. There's a category on archaeoastronomy. And if you click on that particular category on the website, you'll see all of these books on archaeoastronomy. It is my feeling, if you haven't read all of these books on archaeoastronomy, you're not mentally and educationally equipped to discuss archaeoastronomy in a sufficient way. I think it is necessary that you read all of these books on archaeoastronomy before you can have an educated discussion about the subject. Otherwise, it's just conjecture. So I've read all of these books, some of them 2 or 3 times. And I think because of that, I can have a pretty educated discussion about the subject of archaeoastronomy, as I can have about Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism or Christianity or goddess religions. All of these I can talk about in quite significant detail because I have read so many books. But not only have I read the books, I've gone to the sites. So I have both of those knowledge bases. It's like if you try to stand up on one leg, you're going to fall over. You need 2 legs for balance. And in the subject that I'm talking about, you need 2 legs, experience and education, both. You can't just have one. You need to have both. And I have a lot of both.
I'm going to read and come back to you on that, but I have a curiosity question. And this curiosity question is that when we do parikrama or circumambulation in at least in India or in Indic religions, including Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, we do it clockwise. With the sacred is always on our right.
Yeah.
Is that a practice which is common to the rest of the world? Are there any places where it is done the other way around?
Well, then if you study some tantric traditions and Ori Buddhists, and you'll see they go the other direction.
Only they, apart from them.
I would have to say that sometimes, not all the times, the directional rotation that people go in, because a lot of people, a more significant number of people are right-handed than left-handed, so they keep the structure they're walking around on the right-hand side. That is one explanation. I would have to say, if we factor that out, that the left right-hand side out.
Is also clockwise.
Most
of the celestial bodies also move clockwise.
Yeah, so that's another factor. If we factor
any difference between northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere?
That's another factor. You got to account for that. Yeah. I think the 3 things we brought up right there, account for some and perhaps even a significant portion of the directional movement of human beings around these sites. But something that I noticed about 40 years ago when I began dowsing. And there's two primary dowsing tools that people use in the European tradition. One is what are called these L rods, and you can use these L rods to find the directional flow of these energy lines. And then where these energy lines sometimes intersect, I used to hold a pendulum, which is something that just rotates. And I had to be careful to stand at the intersection of these lines such that I wasn't standing on the line, but I was standing in between the lines. And then if I held my hand holding a pendulum over one of what I call energy beam points, there's these places on the earth where there's a shaft of energy that comes up. And a lot of times these lines go through it. And if you hold a pendulum over these energy beam points and you just watch what the pendulum is doing, sometimes it goes clockwise and sometimes it goes counterclockwise. And I think the clockwise or the counterclockwise rotation of the pendulum is indicative of the energy quality of the site, and such that it is, as the Chinese and the Japanese talk about, is it yin or is it yang? Is it negative or positive? Is it masculine or feminine? And over a number of years, I watched this very closely, and I noticed there was a primary rotational movement, either going clockwise or counterclockwise of the pendulum. But then I noticed also it was going in circles, or it was going in a very large variety of ellipses. So it could be going in a clockwise or a counterclockwise movement around the ellipse, but then within that, there was other ellipses or other circles, such that it could be going in a circle around a circle, and it could be going clockwise or counterclockwise in either one. And I have really watched this now, this years now. It's vital that you be right at the energy beam point. In Hindu temples, it is very often impossible right where the deity is stationed. So if we say the deity, we look at the deity from a number of different vantage points. But if we look at the deity, in the sense in Vastu is a really good example of this, where is the statue of the deity placed? If we could move the statue aside and look at it just at that place and hold a pendulum just at that place, deity is moved aside, or it'd be over the head of the deity. But the priests are not going to allow you to do this. But if we could do this, then I think you would notice the same thing that I've been noticing by doing this at a lot of pre-Reformation pilgrimage cathedrals in Europe. Because for a lot of years I used to, now I don't have to do this at all, at least with the L rods. I can find these energy lines on my own. But in the pre-Reformation, and I'm very particular in saying pre-Reformation, the pre-Reformation pilgrimage cathedrals in Europe, you can find these energy lines going through them in specific ways. And a lot of times there are three primary energy beam points. And you can stand in those, and you can hold the pendulum over them, and you can watch what's going on. And I've done this so often. In certain Buddhist shrines, you can do this. In certain Islamic, some you can. Some places you can, some you can't. So it has not been possible for me to record or observe the energy pattern oscillations at all sites. But my feeling is that the energy pattern oscillations are indicative of very, very fine distinctions in the quality or the characteristic of the power of place. In India, I feel that we have a metaphoric indication of what that might be by the personality characteristic of the deity. Is a god or a goddess? And what did the deity do? We see all these Pancha, Buddha, Jyotirlinga, Shiva shrines. Well, what's going on there? Did Shiva actually manifest at these places? Or is the legend about what Shiva did at these sites is a metaphoric indication of the quality, the characteristic of the power of that place? I think this must be examined. A lot of Hindus, they'll say, no, Shiva manifested there, it's Shiva. And I go, maybe yes, maybe no. You should at least consider my theory. Again, it's a theory. I'm not saying I'm right. And anybody that says I'm wrong, do the amount of study that I've done and then tell me. And the greatest scholar in pilgrimage in the Hindu tradition, just the Hindu, is a good friend of mine named Rana Singh, who lives up in Varanasi.
He's my guru.
Yeah.
I've interviewed him 2 times. In fact, he is. I'm going to meet him in a couple of days.
Yeah, well, Rana Singh he's the top scholar in pilgrimage in the Hindu tradition. And the last time I was with Rana, and I said, okay, Rana, who's the top non-Indian scholar in pilgrimage in the Hindu tradition? And he said, you. And I said, well, what about Diana Eck or Alan Marinas? Diana Eck is a professor of comparative religion at Harvard. And Alan Marinas wrote a really great book called Pilgrimage in the Hindu Tradition, a case study in West Bengal. I've read it twice. And he said, well, Martin, you know more because you've been to more places, more of these pilgrimage sites than any of them. And then one day later, he said, Martin, a little embarrassing. You've been to more of these pilgrimage sites than I have.
I am very sure you've been to more places than any of us has been to or can go to.
Well, that's just Hindu. That's just Hindu, because I'm also probably the leading scholar of Buddhist, Sikh, Jain, and Islamic pilgrimage sites in India also. So just speaking of India, because I've met so many. I love India. I've traveled so widely, and so often I meet Indians, and they say, "Where have you been?" And I show them, and they go, "Always." They say, "You've seen more of our country than they have." Always.
Martin,
That's 28, 20.
Yeah.
It's just I'm not bragging. I'm not boasting. This is just what I do.
So very, very quickly, any advice for the modern pilgrims?
Oh, yeah. The best advice is, if you wish to make your prayers according to the tradition of the religion that you've been brought up in, go ahead. The tradition, go ahead. It's beautiful. But if you have not been brought up in a tradition, or you're a Christian and you're going to a Buddhist site, you're a Buddhist and you're going to a Jewish site, you could dispense with the tradition and just pray from your heart. And when I was at Mecca, many years ago, I noticed something very interesting. Very interesting, because if you go to most Islamic mosques and you go to most Islamic pilgrimage sites, you will see pilgrims praying in a certain way. They're reciting certain surahs from the Quran, and depending upon the day, they will say a certain surah. But when you go to Mecca, they're not doing that. Some are, but many are not doing that. What are they doing? They're just expressing prayer from their heart. And so the two things that are essential is go to the place, and when you're at the place, be there. That's it. For example, when you have an electrical device, a lamp, you plug it into the electricity. The lamp doesn't have to do anything. All you do is you plug it in. That's all. And then the electricity is there and the light bulb is illuminated. And the same with a human being. All you have to do is go to the pilgrimage place, go to the site, and you're automatically plugged in. Then you don't have to do anything else. If you wish to walk around in this direction or that direction, if you wish to pray to Vishnu or Saraswati or whatever, if you wish, you can. Not necessary. The necessary thing is plug in. Just be there. Just be there. And then if you have a prayer, pray it. And if you don't have a prayer, say thank you. And if you don't have either one of them, just be there. That's all. Just be there. Just be at the place. That's it. That's all you have to do. Just go and be.
Thank you so much, Martin ji, for all your wisdom. And I'm sure I'll come back to you with many more questions. Thank you.
Bahut dhanyavad. Bahut dhanyavad.
Thank you for joining us on Detours. You can also join us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Our handle is IndiTales, IndiTales. See you soon.